You're about to lose everything you've stolen, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it." The words hung in the mahogany boardroom like a death sentence, spoken by a 28-year-old waitress to three men who controlled millions in community development funds. David Brennan's face went white as Sarah Martinez placed FBI wire transfer records on the table. Each document proof of systematic theft from affordable housing programs meant to help families like the ones she'd served coffee to for 3 years. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, federal agents were already moving through the parking garage, while upstairs, boxes of evidence detailed exactly how $4.8 million had disappeared into shell companies and phantom consulting fees. Hit subscribe if you want to see how a woman with nothing but integrity brought down a corruption network that thought they were untouchable. Because what happens next will restore your faith in justice. We wonder where you're watching from tonight, because maybe you've met someone like her, someone who changed everything with one small act. Sarah Martinez had been wiping down the same coffee-stained table for the third time when the lawyers walked in, their polished shoes clicking against the worn linoleum of morning brew coffee. At 28, she'd learned that life rarely announced its turning points with fanfare. Most of the time, destiny crept in through the back door while you were busy trying to make rent. The morning rush had died down in this corner of Millbrook, New Jersey, leaving behind the familiar smell of burnt coffee and the distant hum of traffic on Route 9. Sarah's reflection in the window showed tired eyes and hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, the uniform of someone who'd been working double shifts for longer than she cared to remember. The rent notice in her locker upstairs felt like a weight in her chest, even though she couldn't see it from here. $300 overdue, with another month's payment due in 2 weeks. Her nursing school fund sat at exactly $47.32, a number she'd memorized from checking her bank balance obsessively. The dream of trading her coffee-stained apron for scrubs felt more distant every month, pushed further away by the simple mathematics of survival. She'd started this job at Morning Brew thinking it would be temporary, a stepping stone towards something better. 3 years later, the stepping stone had become an island, and she wasn't sure she remembered how to swim to shore. The brass key in her pocket had belonged to her parents' house on Elm Street, sold 6 years ago to pay for her mother's final medical bills. Sarah carried it everywhere, a talisman of the stability she'd once known and desperately wanted to build again. Sometimes she'd run her thumb over its worn edges during her break, remembering Sunday mornings when her father would make pancakes and her mother would read the newspaper aloud, their voices creating a symphony of normalcy that seemed impossible now. The key unlocked nothing anymore, but letting go of it felt like abandoning the last piece of who she used to be before life taught her that kindness was a luxury she couldn't always afford. 3 weeks ago, everything had seemed different after the incident with the old man. William Henderson had been a regular for about 6 months, always ordering black coffee and sitting in the corner booth where he could watch the street. He spoke with a slight tremor in his voice and always left exact change, counting out quarters with the deliberate care of someone who understood the value of every cent. That particular morning, he'd knocked over his coffee cup while reaching for sugar, the dark liquid spreading across the table and dripping onto his light blue shirt. Without thinking, Sarah had grabbed towels and helped him clean up, even offering him her own sweater when she noticed him shivering in his coffee-soaked clothes. Henderson had looked at her with unusual intensity that morning, studying her face as if memorizing it. "You have a good heart," he'd said quietly, pressing her sweater back into her hand after the coffee had been cleaned up. "Don't let the world convince you that doesn't matter." Something in his tone had made her pause, not the words themselves, but the way he said them, as if he were delivering a message rather than making conversation. She'd noticed him watching her interactions with other customers more carefully after that, his eyes following her movements as she served the morning regulars and handled the occasional difficult customer with patient professionalism. Now, looking at these lawyers with their expensive suits and serious expressions, Sarah felt that same strange sense of being observed and evaluated. The taller man introduced himself as Marcus Webb, while his companion remained silent, taking notes on a legal pad with gold-edged pages. Webb's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news in sterile conference rooms, but his eyes held something that might have been sympathy. "Miss Martinez, we represent the estate of William Henderson, who passed away last week. I believe you knew him as a customer here." The words hit her like cold water. Henderson was dead, and somehow these strangers knew about their brief interactions over coffee and small acts of kindness. Webb reached into his folder and pulled out an envelope with her name written in shaky handwriting. "Mr. Henderson left specific instructions that this be delivered to you personally. He was quite insistent that we find you here in this place, rather than at your home address." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the envelope, the paper heavier than she'd expected. Around them, the diner continued its quiet morning rhythm, the coffee pot gurgling, the radio playing soft jazz, the occasional clink of silverware against ceramic. But everything felt suspended, as if the universe were holding its breath. She thought of Henderson's last words to her, about having a good heart and not letting the world convince her otherwise, and wondered if he'd somehow known this moment was coming. The key in her pocket seemed to grow warmer as she held the envelope, and for a moment, Sarah could almost hear her mother's voice reminding her that sometimes the smallest acts of decency create the largest ripples. She looked at Webb, then at the envelope, then back at the coffee shop that had been her world for 3 years. Whatever was inside that envelope, whatever Henderson had wanted her to know, she understood with sudden clarity that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. The morning light streaming through the windows felt different now, charged with possibility and tinged with the kind of uncertainty that makes ordinary moments feel extraordinary. "Should I open it now?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Webb nodded, his expression grave, but not unkind. "Mr. Henderson was very specific about timing, Miss Martinez. He wanted you to know exactly what you were stepping into before you made any decisions." As Sarah's fingers found the edge of the envelope flap, she realized she was standing at the threshold of something much larger than herself, something that would test not just her courage, but the very values that had led Henderson to notice her in the first place. The brass key pressed against her leg through the thin fabric of her pocket, a reminder that sometimes the things we think we've lost forever are simply waiting for the right moment to unlock new doors. The envelope contained papers that might as well have been written in a foreign language, filled with legal terms that swam before Sarah's eyes like alphabet soup. Marcus Webb had suggested they move to a quieter booth in the back corner, away from the curious glances of the few remaining morning customers who sensed that something significant was happening but couldn't quite place what. The fluorescent light above their table flickered intermittently, casting shadows that made the documents seem to shift and breathe with their own mysterious life. Sarah read the same paragraph 3 times before the numbers finally penetrated her consciousness. $1.2 million. 51% ownership of something called Millbrook Community Development Corporation, and a position as interim chief executive officer with a 90-day evaluation period. The words felt surreal, like dialogue from a movie she'd accidentally wandered into. Webb leaned forward, his voice dropping to the tone lawyers used when delivering news that would reshape someone's universe. "Mr. Henderson had been observing you for approximately 6 months, Miss Martinez. Not in any intrusive way, but he made it his business to understand the character of people he was considering for this responsibility." Sarah's mind raced back through countless interactions, wondering what Henderson had seen that she hadn't realized she was showing. The way she'd helped Mrs. Chen count exact change when her arthritis made handling coins difficult. How she'd quietly packed extra sandwiches for the construction workers who sometimes came in short on cash toward the end of the month. The patience she'd shown with teenagers who lingered too long over single cups of coffee because they had nowhere else to go. "Why me?" The question escaped before she could stop it, carrying all the bewilderment of someone who'd spent years feeling invisible suddenly being handed the keys to a kingdom she didn't know existed. Webb smiled for the first time since entering the diner, his professional mask slipping to reveal something more human underneath. Mr. Henderson believed that true leadership isn't about credentials or experience. It's about character under pressure. He told me you once gave your own lunch to a customer's child when the family couldn't afford to feed everyone at the table. He said you did it without thinking, without expecting recognition or reward. That's the kind of instinct he was looking for in someone who would have to make difficult decisions about community resources. The mention of the family lunch incident brought back a flood of memories Sarah had tried to forget. The Morales family had come in during the lunch rush, counting crumpled bills and loose change, trying to stretch $8 across 4 hungry people. Sarah had watched the parents quietly discussing which of them would skip eating, their children oblivious to the careful mathematics of poverty happening right above their heads. Without conscious thought, she'd grabbed her own sandwich from behind the counter and presented it as a promotional item, claiming the restaurant was testing new menu options. The gratitude in Mrs. Morales' eyes had been worth more than any tip Sarah had ever received, but she'd never imagined anyone else had been watching that moment unfold. Webb continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone delivering a carefully rehearsed message. The position comes with conditions, Miss Martinez. Millbrook Community Development has been struggling with some internal challenges, and Mr. Henderson believed the organization needed someone from outside the existing power structure to address these issues. You would have 90 days to familiarize yourself with operations, identify problems, and implement solutions. If the board of directors is satisfied with your progress, the position becomes permanent. If not, the assets transfer to a charitable foundation, and you receive a severance package of $50,000. The numbers danced in Sarah's head like figures in an accountant's fever dream, amounts so far beyond her daily reality that they felt abstract, theoretical rather than tangible. The weight of the decision pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. Sarah thought about the nursing program she'd put on hold, the carefully constructed life plan that had been derailed by financial necessity and family tragedy. This opportunity represented a completely different path, one that led into territory she'd never explored, and wasn't sure she was equipped to navigate. But something in Henderson's final words to her echoed in her memory. Don't let the world convince you that doesn't matter. Perhaps he'd been talking about more than just kindness. Perhaps he'd been talking about the importance of values in a world that often seemed to reward their absence. Webb gathered the papers into a neat stack and slid them across the table. There's no rush to decide, Miss Martinez. Mr. Henderson understood this would be overwhelming. Take the weekend to think it over, discuss it with family or friends if you'd like. But I should mention that Millbrook Community Development's board meeting is scheduled for Monday morning, and they're expecting to meet their new interim CEO. Sarah's laugh came out sharper than she intended, tinged with the hysteria of someone being asked to perform surgery after a crash course in first aid. The brass key in her pocket felt heavier now, weighted with the memory of stability she'd once known and the possibility of security she'd never imagined achieving. As Webb and his silent companion gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, the older lawyer paused and looked back at Sarah with an expression that seemed almost paternal. One more thing, Miss Martinez. Mr. Henderson's longtime secretary, Eleanor Walsh, will be at Monday's meeting. He suggested that if you decide to accept this position, you should listen carefully to what she has to say. He believed she had insights that would be valuable to someone in your position. The comment felt loaded with significance Sarah couldn't quite decode. Another piece of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand existed. After the lawyers left, Sarah sat alone in the booth, surrounded by papers that promised to transform her life in ways both thrilling and terrifying. The coffee shop around her continued its familiar rhythm, but everything felt different now, as if she were seeing it through glass, already half removed from this world she'd known for so long. She thought about her parents, wondering what they would have advised, whether they would have encouraged her to take this leap of faith or counseled caution in the face of such overwhelming change. The brass key pressed against her leg through her pocket, a reminder that sometimes the most important doors are the ones we can't see until someone else shows us where they're hidden. The afternoon shift would begin soon, bringing new faces and familiar routines. But Sarah knew with crystalline certainty that this would be one of her last days serving coffee and clearing tables. Whatever lay ahead at Millbrook Community Development, whatever challenges Henderson had cryptically alluded to, she could feel herself already leaning toward acceptance, drawn by the possibility that her years of small kindnesses had been a kind of training for something much larger. The key in her pocket seemed to whisper that some doors, once opened, change not just where you're going, but who you're capable of becoming. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made everything feel possible. But Sarah's confidence evaporated the moment she stood before the glass tower that housed Millbrook Community Development Corporation. The building stretched 12 stories into the New Jersey sky, its reflective surface throwing back distorted images of the woman who'd spent the weekend trading her coffee-stained apron for a borrowed business suit from her neighbor. The lobby smelled of expensive marble and quiet authority, filled with the kind of hushed conversations that suggested important decisions were made here daily. Sarah clutched her purse tighter, feeling the reassuring weight of the brass key inside, and reminded herself that Henderson had chosen her for reasons that went beyond her ability to navigate corporate hallways. The elevator ride to the 9th floor felt like ascending into a different atmosphere, one where the air itself seemed thinner and more rarefied. Sarah's reflection in the polished steel doors showed someone trying desperately to look like they belonged, but she could see uncertainty in her own eyes that no amount of borrowed confidence could mask. When the doors opened, she stepped into a reception area that looked like it had been designed to intimidate visitors into submission. All leather furniture and oil paintings of stern-faced men in expensive suits. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly manicured nails and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, directed Sarah toward a conference room where the board of directors was already assembled. 6 faces turned toward her as she entered, their expressions ranging from curious to openly skeptical. David Brennan, the chief financial officer, stood at the head of a mahogany table that probably cost more than Sarah's annual rent. His silver hair perfectly styled and his navy suit tailored with the precision of someone who understood the importance of appearances. "Miss Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the kind of politeness that barely concealed condescension. "We're certainly curious to understand Mr. Henderson's thinking in this matter." The other board members, 3 men and 2 women whose names Sarah struggled to remember from Webb's introductions, nodded with varying degrees of enthusiasm, their faces a collective study in professional skepticism. After 30 minutes of awkward small talk and procedural explanations, Sarah found herself alone with Eleanor Walsh, Henderson's longtime secretary, in a small office that felt like a time capsule from a more personal era of business. Eleanor was a woman in her early 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of presence that suggested she'd been the real power behind countless important decisions. The office walls were covered with photographs spanning decades. Groundbreaking ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, community events where Henderson appeared alongside local officials and families celebrating new homes. Eleanor closed the door carefully and turned to Sarah with an expression that mixed warmth with urgent concern. "Mr. Henderson left something for you," Eleanor said quietly, reaching into her desk drawer to retrieve a wooden box about the size of a hardcover book. "He was very specific that you should have this after your first board meeting, once you'd seen how they operate." Sarah accepted the box with trembling fingers, feeling immediately that it contained more than documents. It held secrets, the kind that explained why a coffee shop waitress had suddenly inherited control of a multi-million-dollar corporation. The wood was warm to the touch, worn smooth by years of handling. And when Sarah lifted the lid, she found herself looking at manila folders arranged with meticulous care, each labeled with dates spanning the previous 18 months. The first folder contained copies of contracts that made Sarah's stomach tighten with unease, even though she didn't fully understand what she was looking at. Payments to consulting firms with names like Meridian Advisory Solutions and Strategic Development Partners, each invoice for amounts that seemed impossibly large for work that was described in the vaguest possible terms. Eleanor pointed to one particular payment of $230,000 for organizational efficiency assessment, dated just 3 months earlier. Mr. Henderson became suspicious when these consulting fees started appearing regularly, especially since none of the board members could explain exactly what services were being provided or why they were necessary. The implications hung in the air like smoke, acrid and impossible to ignore. Sarah spread the documents across Eleanor's desk, her nursing school math skills suddenly feeling inadequate for the financial puzzle taking shape before her. Shell companies with addresses that led to post office boxes. Subcontractors billing for work on affordable housing projects that seemed to cost twice the normal market rate. A paper trail that twisted through Delaware corporations and consulting agreements that read like legal gibberish designed to obscure rather than clarify. Eleanor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as she explained how Henderson had spent his final months quietly copying documents, taking photographs of computer screens when he thought no one was watching, building a case against people he'd trusted for decades. He discovered that the affordable housing project on Maple Street, the one that was supposed to provide homes for 200 low-income families, had been systematically overcharged through a network of inflated contracts and phantom consulting fees. Eleanor continued, her hand shaking slightly as she pointed to a spreadsheet showing cost comparisons with similar projects in neighboring towns. The numbers told a story of corruption so methodical and extensive that Sarah felt dizzy trying to follow all the connections. $4.8 million that should have built homes for working families had instead disappeared into a web of shell companies and kickback schemes that benefited the very people entrusted to oversee the project's integrity. Sarah thought about the families she served at Morning Brew, construction workers and single mothers and elderly residents who counted every dollar and dreamed of stability that seemed forever out of reach. The idea that money intended to help people like them had been systematically stolen felt like a physical blow to her chest. She understood now why Henderson had chosen someone from outside the system, someone whose loyalty couldn't be purchased and whose moral compass hadn't been gradually corrupted by proximity to power. The brass key in her pocket seemed to pulse with new significance, not just a reminder of what she'd lost, but a symbol of doors that needed to be opened and truths that needed to see daylight. Eleanor reached across the desk and placed her hand over Sarah's, her touch warm and steadying. Mr. Henderson believed you had the strength to do what needed to be done, even when it became dangerous or difficult. He saw something in you that goes beyond kindness. He saw integrity that couldn't be compromised. Sarah looked at the photographs on the wall, seeing them now not just as celebrations of community development, but as evidence of what was possible when resources were used honestly, when power served people instead of exploiting them. She thought about Henderson's final words about not letting the world convince her that kindness didn't matter, understanding now that he'd been preparing her for a battle where kindness would need to become courage. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a mantle she wasn't sure she was strong enough to carry. But Sarah knew with sudden clarity that she couldn't walk away from what Henderson had entrusted to her. The key in her pocket whispered of doors that needed to be unlocked, secrets that needed to be exposed, and a community that deserved better from the people who claimed to serve them. Eleanor smiled at her with the satisfaction of someone who'd recognized a kindred spirit, and Sarah realized that her real education was about to begin, not in boardrooms or business schools, but in the much more dangerous territory where conscience collides with corruption and somebody has to decide which side they're on. The financial records spread across Jennifer Chen's desk looked like the aftermath of an explosion, paper trails radiating in all directions from a central point of corruption that grew clearer with each document they examined. Sarah had found Jennifer through a recommendation from Marcus Webb, a forensic accountant who specialized in untangling the kind of sophisticated fraud that required both mathematical precision and investigative intuition. Jennifer's office in downtown Newark felt more like a detective's workspace than a traditional accounting firm, with whiteboards covered in flowcharts and timelines, computer monitors displaying spreadsheets that looked like treasure maps leading to buried financial crimes. The afternoon sun slanted through Venetian blinds, casting prison bar shadows across documents that told the story of a systematic theft so audacious it bordered on artistic. "This is actually beautiful work, if you can appreciate criminal craftsmanship," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the grudging admiration of a professional who recognized expertise even when it was being used for evil purposes. She pointed to a series of wire transfers that had moved money through 6 different corporate entities before finally landing in accounts controlled by David Brennan and 2 other board members. They created what we call a financial washing machine. Money goes in dirty, gets tumbled through enough legitimate-looking transactions that it comes out clean on the other side. The Maple Street housing project was basically a printing press for these guys. Sarah watched Jennifer trace the money's path with a red pen. each step of the journey documented with the kind of meticulous record-keeping that would make prosecutors smile with anticipation. The scope of the theft became clear as they worked through 18 months of financial records, cross-referencing bank statements with invoices and comparing actual work completed against payments authorized. Brennan had orchestrated the scheme with the precision of a symphony conductor, creating shell companies in Delaware and Nevada that existed only on paper but submitted regular invoices for consulting services that were never actually performed. Strategic development partners had billed $750,000 for community impact assessments that consisted entirely of a 12-page report that could have been written by a college freshman. Meridian Advisory Solutions charged $420,000 for project management coordination that seemed to involve forwarding emails and attending meetings that accomplished nothing of substance. Sarah's anger built steadily as she understood how the fraud had directly harmed the families she'd served coffee to for 3 years. The Martinez family, who'd been on the waiting list for affordable housing for 2 years, had been told their application was delayed due to budgetary constraints, while hundreds of thousands of dollars disappeared into phantom consulting fees. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who cleaned office buildings at night, had been forced to continue living in an apartment with broken heating because the affordable senior housing project had been postponed indefinitely, while money earmarked for her building went to pay for Brennan's vacation home in the Hamptons. Jennifer's computer screen showed bank records indicating regular transfers to accounts linked to luxury purchases that had nothing to do with community development. The technical complexity of the fraud was matched by its emotional brutality. These weren't victimless crimes, but systematic attacks on people who were already struggling to survive in an economy that seemed designed to keep them permanently desperate. Jennifer pulled up photos from the Maple Street construction site, showing foundation work that had been completed months ago but had sat empty, while contractors submitted invoices for work that would never be finished. "Look at this," Jennifer said, pointing to a payment authorization for $68,000 to a subcontractor called Garden State Electrical Services. "The company exists, they do legitimate work, but they never actually performed electrical work on this project. Someone forged their invoices and pocketed the money." Sarah felt the brass key in her pocket grow warm as she studied the evidence, understanding now that Henderson had died knowing exactly who had betrayed the community's trust and how they'd done it. The documents Eleanor had given her weren't just random suspicious contracts. They were pieces of a criminal puzzle that Henderson had been assembling for months, preparing for a confrontation he wouldn't live to see. Jennifer's analysis revealed that the theft totaled $4.8 million over 18 months, money that had been systematically diverted from affordable housing projects, job training programs, and community development initiatives that would have transformed dozens of families' lives for the better. "The beautiful thing about financial crimes," Jennifer said with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent years hunting corporate predators, "is that criminals always leave paper trails because they need to justify their actions to themselves and their accomplices. Every wire transfer, every forged invoice, every shell company registration creates evidence that prosecutors love because numbers don't lie, and bank records are very hard to dispute in court." Sarah watched Jennifer compile their findings into a presentation that would serve as a roadmap for law enforcement, complete with timelines, financial flowcharts, and recommendations for criminal charges that could put Brennan and his associates in federal prison for decades. The investigation had taken 3 weeks of 12-hour days, but Sarah finally understood the full scope of what Henderson had entrusted to her. This wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about reclaiming resources that belonged to the community and ensuring they would be used for their intended purpose. Jennifer's final report included specific recommendations for recovering the stolen funds, restructuring Millbrook Community Development's oversight procedures, and implementing safeguards that would prevent future theft. Sarah thought about the families who'd been denied housing, the workers who'd lost job training opportunities, the seniors who'd been forced to remain in substandard living conditions while their advocates lined their own pockets with money meant to help them. The brass key in her pocket felt heavier now, weighted with the responsibility of unlocking not just secrets, but justice for people who'd been systematically betrayed by those they'd trusted to help them. Sarah understood that confronting Brennan would require more than evidence. It would require the kind of moral courage that Henderson had seen in her during their brief interactions over coffee and small acts of human decency. Jennifer packed the financial evidence into boxes that would soon find their way to the FBI's white-collar crime unit. But Sarah knew that the real battle was just beginning. The numbers told a clear story of theft and betrayal, but transforming that story into accountability would require her to become the kind of person she'd never imagined being. Someone willing to stand up to power even when doing so meant risking everything she'd worked to achieve. The sun was setting over Newark as they finished organizing the evidence, casting long shadows across documents that represented months of systematic theft from some of the most vulnerable people in New Jersey. Sarah thought about Henderson's final words about not letting the world convince her that kindness didn't matter, understanding now that sometimes kindness needed to sharpen itself into justice. That compassion without courage was just sentimentality that allowed evil to flourish unchecked. The key in her pocket whispered that some doors, once opened, couldn't be closed again. That seeing the truth meant accepting the responsibility to act on it, no matter how frightening or overwhelming that action might prove to be. The boardroom on the 11th floor felt different this time, as if the expensive mahogany and leather furniture had absorbed the tension that radiated from Sarah as she placed 3 manila folders on the polished table before David Brennan and his closest allies. The afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows created a theatrical atmosphere, casting sharp shadows that made everyone's faces look more angular and predatory than they had during her first naive encounter with the board 3 weeks earlier. Brennan sat at the head of the table with the confidence of someone who'd never been seriously challenged. His silver hair perfectly styled, and his expression carrying the kind of bemused tolerance reserved for children who thought they understood adult conversations. Board members Patricia Hoffman and James Kellerman flanked him like loyal lieutenants, their faces masks of professional courtesy that couldn't quite hide their curiosity about why Sarah had requested this private meeting. Sarah opened the first folder with hands steadier than she'd expected, revealing Jennifer Chen's forensic analysis presented in the kind of clear mathematical language that left no room for interpretation or denial. Gentlemen, Mrs. Hoffman, I've spent the past 3 weeks reviewing Millbrook Community Development's financial records, and I've discovered some irregularities that require immediate attention. Her voice carried a new authority born from weeks of studying evidence, transforming the uncertain waitress who'd first walked into this room into someone who understood exactly what she was dealing with. Brennan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, his confidence flickering like a candle in a sudden draft, while Hoffman and Kellerman exchanged glances that confirmed they knew exactly what was coming. The wire transfer records Jennifer had assembled told a story so clear that even someone without accounting experience could follow the money's path from Millbrook Community Development's accounts into the shell companies that existed solely to enrich the 3 people sitting across from Sarah. Strategic Development Partners, Meridian Advisory Solutions, Garden State Consulting Group. These companies have received a total of $4.8 million from MCD over the past 18 months for services that were either never performed or grossly overvalued compared to market rates. Sarah watched Brennan's face as she spoke, noting how his jaw tightened when she mentioned specific dollar amounts and how his fingers drummed against the table in a rhythm that suggested a man calculating odds and possible responses. Brennan leaned back in his chair with the kind of calculated calm that wealthy men use when they're about to deploy their most dangerous weapons. Miss Martinez, I appreciate your enthusiasm for understanding our operations, but I'm concerned you may be misinterpreting complex business relationships that require significant experience to fully comprehend. His voice carried the patronizing tone of someone explaining advanced concepts to a child. But Sarah had spent weeks preparing for exactly this response. She opened the second folder and spread bank records across the table, showing transfers from the shell companies directly into personal accounts belonging to Brennan, Hoffman, and Kellerman, amounts that corresponded exactly with the inflated consulting payments. Perhaps you could help me understand these complex business relationships, Sarah replied, her voice carrying an edge that surprised her with its sharpness. For instance, how Strategic Development Partners' payment of $67,000 for organizational efficiency assessment ended up in your personal account at First National Bank, 3 days after MCD authorized the consulting fee. Hoffman's face went pale, while Kellerman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But Brennan's expression hardened into something that looked more like his true character: calculating, ruthless, and entirely comfortable with the idea that rules existed to be circumvented by people clever enough to find the loopholes. The confrontation Sarah had been dreading for weeks finally crystallized into the kind of moral clarity that made complex situations suddenly simple. "I'm prepared to offer you a choice," she continued, opening the third folder to reveal copies of documents that Jennifer had already forwarded to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. "You can resign from your positions immediately, cooperate fully with auditors to recover the stolen funds, and accept responsibility for your actions. Or this evidence goes to federal prosecutors, and you face criminal charges for mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft from a federally funded program." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush the oxygen from the room, broken only by the distant hum of traffic 12 floors below and the barely audible sound of 3 people's breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Brennan's mask of professional courtesy finally slipped completely, revealing the angry desperation of someone who'd spent years believing himself untouchable, only to discover that a coffee shop waitress had outmaneuvered him using nothing more sophisticated than basic arithmetic and moral clarity. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said, his voice dropping to the register men use when they want to sound threatening without technically making threats. "This organization requires sophisticated management, complex financial strategies that someone with your background couldn't possibly understand. The board has already discussed concerns about your qualifications, and I think you'll find that your position here is much more tenuous than Mr. Henderson's will might have led you to believe." Sarah felt the brass key in her pocket press against her leg as she stood to face Brennan across the mahogany expanse that no longer seemed intimidating but merely expensive furniture in a room where important decisions were being made by someone who'd learned that integrity was more powerful than influence. "My qualifications," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd discovered her own strength, "include the ability to recognize theft when I see it, and the moral clarity to understand that $4.8 million stolen from affordable housing programs represents homes that families will never have, job training that workers will never receive, and opportunities that children will never get because you decided your comfort was more important than their futures." The meeting's conclusion felt inevitable once the battle lines had been drawn so clearly, but Sarah was surprised by Eleanor's quiet knock on the boardroom door, and her subsequent entrance carrying a box of additional documents that made Brennan's face go completely white. "I thought you might need these," Eleanor said quietly, placing bank records on the table that showed payments to Brennan's wife's consulting firm, his son's construction company, and a network of family businesses that had been feeding at the Millbrook Community Development Trough for years. Sarah realized that Henderson's investigation had been even more comprehensive than she'd understood, that the evidence Eleanor had been carefully preserving could destroy not just Brennan's career, but his entire family's financial empire. The brass key in her pocket felt warm against her leg as Sarah watched 3 people who'd spent years stealing from the community they were supposed to serve finally understand that their actions had consequences, that someone with no connections or influence could still wield the most powerful weapon of all: the truth, carefully documented and impossible to deny. Brennan's final words carried the venom of someone who'd underestimated his opponent and was now facing the consequences of that miscalculation. "This isn't over, Miss Martinez. You may have won this battle, but running this organization requires more than moral indignation. The board will hear about your threats, and we'll see how long your righteous anger sustains you when you're facing the real challenges of community development." Sarah gathered her documents with the satisfaction of someone who discovered that courage was like a muscle. The more you used it, the stronger it became. The key in her pocket whispered that some confrontations were just the beginning, that exposing corruption was only the first step in the longer process of building something better. As she left the boardroom, she understood that Brennan was right about one thing: this wasn't over. But she also knew that Henderson had chosen well, that the qualities he'd seen in her during their brief encounters over coffee were exactly what would be needed for the battles ahead. The emergency board meeting convened at 9 o'clock Monday morning in a conference room that had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom, with local reporters from the Millbrook Herald and Newark Star-Ledger positioned along the back wall like a jury of public opinion. Sarah arrived to find FBI Special Agent Catherine Morrison setting up recording equipment at a side table, her presence lending an air of federal authority that made everyone speak in hushed, careful tones. The boardroom that had once felt like Brennan's personal kingdom now buzzed with the nervous energy of people who understood they were about to witness either justice or a very sophisticated form of character assassination, depending on whose version of events proved more compelling to the assembled witnesses. Brennan had clearly spent the weekend preparing for war, surrounded by 3 attorneys whose expensive suits and briefcases full of legal documents suggested he intended to fight Sarah's allegations with every procedural weapon at his disposal. His opening statement carried the polished confidence of someone who'd survived corporate battles before, his voice projecting the kind of wounded dignity that powerful men employ when their integrity is questioned by people they consider beneath their notice. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today because a well-meaning but tragically inexperienced individual has made serious accusations based on a fundamental misunderstanding of complex financial instruments and standard business practices in the community development sector. Sarah watched Brennan's performance with the detached interest of someone who'd spent weeks learning to read financial documents the way most people read novels, understanding now that sophisticated language was often just camouflage for simple theft. When her turn came to respond, she stood with Jennifer Chen's forensic analysis in one hand and a folder of bank records in the other, feeling the brass key in her pocket like a talisman connecting her to Henderson's memory and the community he truly served. Mr. Brennan is correct that this involves complex financial instruments, she began, her voice carrying across the room with surprising authority. Unfortunately for him, those instruments are called wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to defraud a federally funded program. The evidence unfolded with the methodical precision of a mathematical proof, each document building on the previous revelation until the pattern of theft became impossible to deny or explain away through legal technicalities. Sarah presented Jennifer's analysis showing how strategic development partners had billed $750,000 for community impact assessments that consisted entirely of a 12-page report plagiarized from a municipal planning website, how Meridian Advisory Solutions had charged $420,000 for project management services that involved forwarding emails and attending meetings that accomplished nothing measurable. The reporters scribbled notes furiously while Agent Morrison nodded approvingly at evidence that would make federal prosecutors extremely happy to pursue convictions. The moment that transformed the meeting from corporate drama into something approaching justice came when Eleanor Walsh stood to address the board, her voice shaking slightly as she revealed information that even Sarah hadn't known existed. Mr. Henderson didn't just suspect financial irregularities. He'd been working with the FBI for 6 months before his death, wearing a recording device and documenting conversations where Mr. Brennan explicitly discussed hiding payments through shell companies and splitting kickbacks among board members. The room erupted in whispers and shuffling papers as Eleanor played an audio recording on her phone, Henderson's familiar voice filling the conference room from beyond the grave as he confronted Brennan about forged invoices and missing funds. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath everyone's feet as Eleanor continued her revelations, explaining that Henderson had discovered the corruption months earlier but needed time to build an airtight case that would survive the kind of legal challenges wealthy defendants could afford. He chose Miss Martinez not because she was inexperienced, but because her moral character had been tested repeatedly in small ways that revealed how she would respond to larger challenges. He wanted someone whose integrity couldn't be purchased and whose loyalty belonged to the community rather than to personal advancement or professional networks. The brass key in Sarah's pocket seemed to pulse with vindication as she understood the full scope of Henderson's plan and her role in bringing it to completion. The next revelation struck the room like lightning, delivered by Agent Morrison with the clinical precision of someone who'd spent years building cases against white-collar criminals. The FBI has been monitoring financial transactions related to Millbrook Community Development for 8 months, And we have evidence of systematic fraud totaling $4.8 million that should have funded affordable housing for 200 low-income families. She gestured toward boxes of evidence that her team had been accumulating while Brennan believed himself untouchable. Bank records and wire transfers and recorded phone conversations that painted a picture of corruption so comprehensive it seemed almost artistic in its audacity. But the moment that transformed the entire narrative came when Henderson himself appeared on Agent Morrison's laptop screen via a pre-recorded video message. His familiar voice carrying across the conference room with the authority of someone speaking from a place beyond threats or intimidation. If you're watching this recording, it means I've passed away and Miss Martinez has accepted the responsibility I offered her. I want everyone in this room to understand that Sarah Martinez isn't an inexperienced outsider. She's exactly the kind of person we need leading community development efforts because she understands that our job is to serve families, not to enrich ourselves at their expense. The revelation that Henderson had faked his death to protect himself while building the criminal case sent shockwaves through the room that Sarah could feel in her bones. Sarah's final statement to the board carried the weight of someone who discovered that courage was contagious, that standing up to powerful people inspired others to find their own strength. The $4.8 million that Mr. Brennan and his associates stole represents homes that families will never have, job training programs that workers will never access, and opportunities that children will never receive. But recovering that money is only the beginning. We're going to restructure this organization to ensure that every dollar serves the community it was intended to help, with transparency policies and oversight mechanisms that make this kind of theft impossible in the future. The unanimous vote to terminate Brennan, Hoffman, and Kellerman felt like justice finally arriving after months of careful preparation, while Agent Morrison's announcement of immediate arrests transformed the boardroom into a crime scene where handcuffs replaced handshakes. The brass key in Sarah's pocket felt lighter as she watched federal agents lead the three conspirators away in handcuffs, their expensive suits and confident expressions replaced by the gray jumpsuit reality of people who'd forgotten that stealing from the poor was still stealing, regardless of how sophisticated the methods used to accomplish it. The reporters filed stories that would run on the front page of both local newspapers, but Sarah understood that the real victory wasn't the dramatic arrest or the recovered funds. It was the knowledge that Henderson's faith in her character had been justified and that the community would finally receive the advocacy it deserved. The key whispered that some doors, once opened, revealed not just corruption, but the possibility of building something better in its place. Something worthy of the trust that vulnerable people placed in institutions they hoped would help rather than exploit them. 6 months after David Brennan's perp walk made the front page of every newspaper in central New Jersey, Sarah stood in the construction trailer overlooking the Maple Street affordable housing project, watching bulldozers break ground on foundations that would finally provide homes for families who'd been waiting years for their chance at stability. The recovered $4.8 million had been supplemented by additional federal grants once HUD officials realized that Millbrook Community Development was now run by people who actually intended to spend money on community development rather than personal enrichment. The morning air carried the sound of construction equipment and workers calling to each other in English and Spanish, voices that represented jobs created by an organization that was finally fulfilling its original mission. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate, requiring months of painstaking work to rebuild systems that Brennan and his associates had deliberately corrupted to facilitate their theft. Sarah had hired Jennifer Chen as the organization's new chief financial officer, implementing transparency protocols that required public posting of all contracts over $10,000 and community oversight committees with real authority to approve or reject development proposals. Every wire transfer now required dual authorization. Every consulting agreement included specific deliverables with measurable outcomes, and every board meeting was live-streamed to ensure that community members could witness the decisions being made in their name. The bureaucracy was more cumbersome than the old system, but Sarah had learned that efficiency without accountability was just another word for corruption. Eleanor Walsh had accepted the position of operations director, bringing decades of institutional knowledge to the task of identifying and fixing problems that had been deliberately ignored during the Brennan years. Together, they discovered maintenance issues at existing MCD properties that had been neglected while money disappeared into shell company accounts. Heating systems that hadn't been properly serviced for years while consulting fees funded Brennan's family vacations. The backlog of repairs had required an additional $2 million in emergency funding. But Sarah took satisfaction in knowing that elderly residents would no longer spend winter nights wearing coats indoors because their advocates had been too busy stealing from them to ensure their basic safety and comfort. The Millbrook Community Development Foundation had launched with a charter specifically designed to prevent the kind of institutional capture that had enabled Brennan's theft. Governed by a board that included representatives from tenant organizations, local churches, and community groups that had been systematically excluded from decision-making during the previous administration. Sarah had insisted that foundation board meetings be held in community centers and church basements rather than corporate boardrooms, creating an atmosphere where families affected by housing decisions could participate directly rather than being reduced to statistics and reports they'd never see. The foundation's first initiative provided college scholarships for children of affordable housing residents, funded entirely by recovered assets from Brennan's shell company network. The numbers told a story of systematic improvement that Sarah reviewed each morning with the kind of satisfaction she'd once reserved for perfectly brewed coffee and satisfied customers. Unemployment in Millbrook's targeted neighborhoods had dropped from 23% to 8% as construction projects created jobs for local workers, many of whom had completed training programs through partnerships with the county community college. The waiting list for affordable housing had been reduced from 400 families to 60 as new units came online ahead of schedule and under budget, an achievement that local newspapers attributed to eliminating the corruption that had inflated costs and delayed completion for years. Sarah's own transformation mirrored the organization's evolution, from someone who'd been afraid to challenge authority to someone who understood that real leadership meant holding systems accountable to the people they claimed to serve. She'd completed an executive leadership program at Rutgers while continuing to run MCD, learning the technical skills needed to navigate municipal politics and federal regulations without losing the moral clarity that Henderson had recognized in her. The brass key from her childhood home had found new purpose as a reminder that some doors needed to be opened and others needed to be locked, that protecting vulnerable people required both compassion and competence. The legal aftermath of the Brennan investigation had provided additional vindication and resources, with federal prosecutors securing convictions that resulted in restitution payments totaling $6.2 million once penalties and interest were calculated. Brennan himself received a sentence of 8 years in federal prison, while Hoffman and Kellerman received lighter sentences in exchange for cooperation that helped investigators trace additional corruption in other community development organizations across New Jersey. The FBI had used evidence from the Millbrook case to launch investigations in 6 other municipalities, creating a deterrent effect that Sarah hoped would protect future communities from the kind of systematic theft her residents had endured. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the first phase of the Maple Street project drew more than 300 people, including families who would soon move into new homes and workers whose jobs had been created by an organization that now understood its mission was employment generation as well as housing development. Sarah spoke briefly about Henderson's vision and the community's resilience, but she was more interested in listening to the speeches from new homeowners who talked about stability and opportunity, and the simple dignity of living in a place where heating systems worked and landlords couldn't raise rent arbitrarily. The brass key in her pocket felt warm as she watched children run through construction areas that represented their families' futures, understanding that Henderson's faith in her character had created possibilities that extended far beyond what either of them could have imagined. The transformation of Millbrook Community Development had attracted national attention from housing advocates and federal officials who saw the organization as a model for accountability and effectiveness in community development. Sarah received speaking requests from conferences and universities, opportunities to share lessons learned about building systems that served communities rather than exploiting them. But her favorite moments remained the quiet conversations with residents who stopped by the MCD office to thank her for changes that had improved their daily lives. Better maintenance response times, respectful treatment from staff, and the simple satisfaction of knowing that their advocates actually advocated for them rather than viewing them as sources of revenue. The brass key that had once represented loss and displacement now symbolized the possibility that institutions could be reformed and communities could be served by people who understood that public service was exactly that. Service to the public rather than service to personal ambition or financial gain. Sarah kept the key on her desk next to a photograph of Henderson, understanding that his legacy wasn't just the exposure of corruption, but the demonstration that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they combined moral clarity with systematic effort. The key whispered that some doors, once opened, revealed not just problems but solutions, not just corruption but the possibility of building something worthy of the community's trust and deserving of their hope. The morning sun cast long shadows across the familiar interior of Morning Brew Coffee as Sarah pushed through the glass door for the first time in 8 months. The chime announcing her arrival with the same cheerful persistence it had welcomed her to work for 3 years. The coffee shop looked smaller than she remembered, worn around the edges in ways that her memory had softened. But the smell of brewing coffee and the sound of early morning conversations created a symphony of normalcy that felt like coming home after a long and transforming journey. She wasn't here to work today. Her business suit and confident stride marked her as a customer rather than staff. But the familiarity of this space still tugged at something deep in her chest, a reminder of who she'd been before Henderson changed everything with his quiet observation and final act of faith. The morning regulars looked up with recognition and curiosity as Sarah approached the counter, their faces reflecting the strange celebrity that came with being featured on the front page of newspapers and local television news. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman whose arthritis made counting change difficult, waved from her usual corner booth, while the construction workers who'd once lingered over single cups of coffee because they had nowhere else to go, now chatted comfortably about overtime hours and steady paychecks created by MCD's new transparency policies. The waitress behind the counter, a young woman named Maria, who looked tired in ways that Sarah remembered intimately, served coffee with the kind of efficient kindness that had once defined Sarah's own approach to customer service. Henderson was waiting in the back booth where he'd sat every morning for 6 months, his familiar face carrying the satisfaction of someone whose carefully orchestrated plan had exceeded even his own expectations. The newspapers had reported his death as an elaborate FBI protection scheme designed to keep him safe while federal investigators built their case. But seeing him alive and well still felt surreal, like conversing with someone who'd returned from another dimension. He stood when she approached, his handshake warm and his eyes bright with the kind of energy that came from watching justice unfold exactly as he'd hoped it would. "Miss Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the same tremor she remembered but stronger now, steadied by the satisfaction of knowing his life's work had been completed successfully. They talked for nearly an hour about the changes at Millbrook Community Development, Henderson listening with the intense interest of someone who'd invested everything in an outcome he wouldn't live to see fully realized. Sarah described the ribbon-cutting ceremonies and the families moving into new homes, the job training programs, and the community oversight committees that ensured transparency would become permanent rather than temporary. Henderson nodded approvingly when she mentioned the college scholarship program and smiled broadly when she explained how Eleanor had restructured the organization's operations to prevent future corruption. "You've exceeded every expectation I had," he said quietly, "but I always knew you would. Character reveals itself under pressure, and you've proven that integrity scales beautifully from coffee shops to corporate boardrooms." The conversation eventually turned to Henderson's motivations and the elaborate deception he'd orchestrated to protect himself while building a criminal case that would survive the kind of legal challenges wealthy defendants could afford. "I chose you," he explained, "not because you were inexperienced, but because your experience was in serving people rather than manipulating systems for personal gain. I needed someone whose moral compass hadn't been corrupted by proximity to power. Someone who would see theft as theft rather than a sophisticated financial strategy." Sarah understood now that every interaction between them had been a test, Henderson evaluating her character through small moments that revealed how she would respond to larger challenges. The brass key had become a symbol of transformation rather than loss, its presence in Sarah's pocket no longer a reminder of childhood security she'd never recover, but evidence that some things lost could be transformed into something even more valuable. Sarah reached into her purse and withdrew a small wrapped package, placing it carefully on the table between them. "I wanted to give you something," she said, watching Henderson's expression as he unwrapped the gift to reveal a brass key identical to her own, engraved with the words, "For doors that open new possibilities." Henderson's eyes filled with tears as he understood the significance, that Sarah was sharing not just a token, but the symbol of her own transformation from victim to advocate. Their final conversation turned to the future and the responsibility that came with institutional power. Henderson offering advice about maintaining the moral clarity that had made her effective while learning to navigate the political complexities that would define her continued leadership of MCD. "The moment you start believing that the rules don't apply to you is the moment you become like Brennan," he warned, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades watching good people gradually compromise their values through small accommodations and ethical shortcuts. Sarah promised him that she would remember this conversation whenever she felt tempted by the kind of expedient solutions that seemed easier than transparent accountability. As Henderson prepared to leave, he was moving to Florida to be closer to his grandchildren, his public service career finally and definitively concluded. Sarah felt the weight of legacy settling on her shoulders like a mantle she was now strong enough to carry. The community she served understood that their advocates actually advocated for them, that their resources were being used efficiently and ethically, that their voices mattered in decisions that affected their daily lives. The brass key in her pocket whispered that some transformations couldn't be reversed, that once you'd seen how institutions could serve people rather than exploiting them, you couldn't pretend that corruption was acceptable or inevitable. Henderson's final words carried the satisfaction of someone whose life's work had achieved its intended purpose. Sometimes the smallest acts of decency create the largest possibilities for justice. You prove that kindness is not weakness. It's the foundation that real leadership is built on. Sarah watched him walk away, understanding that their brief relationship had taught her something more valuable than any business school curriculum. That power was a tool that could be used to serve others or to serve oneself, and that the difference between those choices determined whether institutions helped communities thrive or simply helped wealthy people become wealthier at everyone else's expense. The key in her pocket felt warm against her leg as Sarah finished her coffee and prepared to return to work that now felt like calling rather than just employment. The families in MCD housing could count on heating systems that worked and maintenance requests that received prompt attention. Workers had access to job training programs that led to actual employment rather than just certificates that employers didn't recognize. Children whose parents lived in affordable housing could apply for college scholarships funded by money that had been recovered from thieves who'd forgotten that stealing from the poor was still stealing, regardless of how sophisticated the methodology used to accomplish it. Sometimes kindness opens doors power never could, and sometimes those doors lead to places worth spending your life protecting and building and serving with everything you have to give.